I'm pleased to introduce Branko Marcetic, who is a staff writer for Jacobin, and he wrote what I consider to be the most comprehensive article on Kamala Harris, and we're going to be talking about that tonight. How are you doing tonight, Branko?
I'm doing great. How are you going?
I'm good. I'm really excited about having you on the show and talking about who we're talking about. Branko also did one of the 3 articles on Beto O'Rourke, questioning his progressive bona fides. And we're also going to talk about Elizabeth Warren, because she actually did announce, unlike Kamala or Beto, they're still, in the Twitter sphere as potential candidates. So before we talk about the substance of your article, why don't you tell my viewers a little bit about yourself, where you're from, because you don't live in this country, and it's really interesting how you know so much about American politics.
Well, I think people in the U.S. often don't realize how much people around the world actually do keep up with U.S. politics. People, every presidential election that I've been alive for, people in New Zealand, which is where I'm from, have always, taken an intense interest to it, and sometimes, Americans actually who come to live in New Zealand or other countries are shocked sometimes at how much people actually know. Sometimes they know more than they do, seemingly, about U.S. politics. So, I think it's the reach of U.S. culture is very wide. And I think for me, I studied U.S. history as well in university, and I did my thesis on an incredibly obscure specific subject, but a libertarian magazine that was sort of the forerunner to the National Review, which I think your viewers might know as the sort of flagship conservative publication. And this is sort of the one that came, the prototype almost, the one that came just before it. So I think I sort of have I guess I always had an interest in U.S. politics, and when I did live here, I got into journalism and worked for a few different publications here, and from there I sort of ended up at Jacobin, which is where I am now. So it's sort of a Cliff Notes version of my history.
And why don't you tell us a little bit about Jacobin, for those who don't know? It's a socialist publication, right?
That's right. It's a socialist publication. It was founded in, I'm going to get this wrong, but I want to say 2011 by Bhaskar Sankara, a publisher. It sort of started out as this very kind of, as kind of a hustle to an extent, in the sense that Bhaskar was doing everything by himself. He believed in the socialist vision, and he, would devoted his entire sort of free time outside of work to sort of getting the publication off the ground. And it started off from, a very small base of readership to really ballooning in the years since, and really it's ironically been helped as well by the Trump's election, which I think has kind of given a boost to a lot of progressive and leftist publications. But although Jacobin has been growing even before then, and really at the first, on the back of sort of Bhaskar's kind of blood, sweat, and tears, and then our designer Ramika Forbes's design talent. I mean, if you ever go to the website, it's a Jacobin. Really, it's a socialist publication that kind of threw away that kind of like drab look that people I think associate with the left, and as a really vibrant and I think really amazing design that I think helped to kind of bring people in, and a host of talented editors and writers that I could go on for a very long time, but I'm not going to not cut into your show's time.
Okay, well, let's get right into your article about Kamala Harris. Now, of course, people that follow me know that I have a hashtag for her, counterfeit Kamala, which I spell counterfeit with a K, because I really do think that she is reinventing herself as a progressive because she wants to run for president. And I knew a few things about her. Of course, there was that excellent article in The Intercept about how she refused to prosecute Steve Mnuchin, even though her staff recommended, because of foreclosure fraud. And it was notable that he had contributed to her attorney general's race. And then after she didn't prosecute him, he contributed to her her Senate race. And, I knew a few other things about her criminal justice platform, the fact that she, her staff did not want to release prisoners early. They were against the early release program because they thought they would lose a lot of free labor or cheap labor, prison labor. And actually, it was the Center for American Progress that blew the whistle on that one. And when they interviewed her, she said, I was shocked. I was shocked to find that out. And it kind of reminded me of Casablanca, where Claude Rains said, I'm shocked to find there's gambling going on here,
Yeah.
And I also knew, and it was really great that you got the stuff with Carlos Marroquin, because he's a buddy of mine from Occupy Fights Foreclosures. I remember when he did that protest outside of the California Democratic Convention, because he tried to get meetings with her. He was helping families that were facing a foreclosure, that were being fraudulently foreclosed on. He was trying to get meetings with her and couldn't get her to meet. So he was kind of forced to do a protest. And I remember watching that and seeing how, like any other politician, if they were classy, they would go over and talk to these victims and see what was their concerns. But she didn't do it. She just hightailed it right out of there and walked right past them. So that was really telling to me about, how concerned she was. But you have so much more that you talk about in your article, and you start out with a lot of good things that she did, which I didn't know. And I think we should start out and give her credit where credit is due. So why don't you tell, for the viewers who haven't read your article, go through some of the list of things that Kamala Harris did that you think were laudable.
Yeah, I mean, I think she came in with a principled objection to the death penalty, for example. And under a lot of pressure, there was a policeman who was killed, and she was under a lot of pressure to seek the death penalty, and she refused. Dianne Feinstein, in fact, criticized her, obliquely criticized her at the funeral for this police officer, and sort of, for lack of a better word, really put her on a spot. And so I think she deserves credit for that. She's gone after. It's been a little while since I've looked at the piece, but she went after a host of polluters in California. She has, of late, signed on to the Medicare for All legislation, which is good. In fact, I read an op-ed by her just the other week where she talked about how it was important to get single payer on the table, speaking from sort of personal experience of when her mother died. She also refused to, when she was in California, she refused to defend the proposition that basically banned gay marriage. So that's good. There's probably a few other things. I believe she's gone after a few other kind of corporate actors.
I want to talk a little bit about her smart on crime, which, there were some good aspects to that, like she wanted to, the gist of it was she wanted to catch criminals early and try to divert people from becoming criminals by providing them with education and jobs, which is good. She had, you mentioned she had education and job training for nonviolent third strikers rather than putting them in prison. She supported some undocumented immigrant who was applying for a law license.
Yeah.
She sponsored legislation for transparency and data collection. She opposed the Shoot the Gays ballot initiative. She adopted,
which bare minimum. I mean,
right?
You would hope that some of these, you would hope that a Democrat would, especially a Democrat in the blue state, would, oppose some of these things. So there's a lot of good stuff. The problem with Kamala Harris is that, as alongside this good stuff, there's often very inextricably linked some bad things, very bad things. That she didn't seek the death penalty in that case I told you about, but she also continued to defend the legality of the death penalty. And you can make the argument that she did that because she saw that it was her role, in her position to do that, and she had to sort of abide by the law. But and sort of abide, I guess, by maybe what the voters thought. But it's that I think is a little bit concerning. I think even more concerning is the fact that when I believe she was up for Attorney General, she ran to the right of her Republican opponent, who was actually against three strikes, because he said that three strikes, as we know, is a completely idiotic law that that's sort of more of a slogan, a vindictive, punitive slogan, than an actual smart piece of legislation or approach to dealing with crime. And she actually ran to his right, saying that no, we should keep three strikes. We should just sort of slightly moderate it, And I think that is a very clear kind of case. It gives you an insight into who she is as a politician. Since then, when she was in California, she also went after Backpage, which was, on the one hand, yes, it was a sort of breeding ground for sort of child sex trafficking, but it was also a place where sex workers used to find clients, and was far more safe than sort of being out on the street or having to rely on a pimp or something, or that kind of thing. And actually, sex workers were united in opposition to her going after Backpage, because they said that this is going to make our lives hell. This is going to be it's going to make us less safe. Basically, they called it a sort of stunt. It's a very good headline when you think about it.
Well, I want to just interject about that, because
sure.
People who are familiar with my work know that I'm not against individual sex workers, but I am what is called a radical anti-porn feminist, and I'm really more against pornography and than I am prostitution. But I do think that these, like work, to make it like legitimate work, like I understand that she didn't want to legalize it. I don't think it should be legalized myself. I think it should be decriminalized. And I think that workers should have, protections. However, I do think I put sex work in the same category as I put fracking. I think it's work, but it's not work that benefits society. And I've done a whole show on that, so I'm not going to repeat my viewpoint, but I don't necessarily have a problem with, the FOSTA and the SESTA and all that other stuff that she supported, because I do think that they do get a lot of women are trafficked into these professions, and this whole idea of this empowering, choice that women are making is more of a mythology than it is actual fact.
Well, I think, I mean, we could. That's a whole other conversation. I think with this law, it's the same. I mean, what it did was, whether we like it or not, women are going to turn to sex work to support themselves financially, regardless. And what this did was it put a lot of vulnerable women back onto the street and back in the hands of pimps. We're actually seeing it right now. So I think we could have that conversation.
It enables. Okay. So moving on to the next, she also urged voters to reject Proposition 66. What was Proposition 66?
You're going to have to give me a second so I can remember. It's been a little while. So that was, it was, it would have reformed the three strikes law, basically, by making only serious or violent kind of felonies to trigger violence, life sentences, which is sort of it's a reforming of the three strikes law. It would have made it, a little less harsh. It would have not made it not sent quite as many people into cages for life.
She also didn't take positions on Prop 47 and Prop 56, which I believe were great laws, because they put a lot of nonviolent people that were in jail for mostly nonviolent drug possession misdemeanors or, felonies, but now they can be reduced to a misdemeanor and they could be let out. And she didn't support that. So, I mean, she is a prosecutor, in fact, there's somebody I follow on Twitter whose Twitter handle is Kamala Harris is a cop. And she writes some, great things. But, I really feel like her whole thing now of being against mass incarceration is more counterfeit than it is real, based on some of these things that we're talking about.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think one of the worst kind of instances is the example of Daniel Larson, who was arrested for a crime that he didn't commit. I think it was on probation, and the police mistakenly identified him as the criminal in question. In a separate matter, they found a knife on him, and that was a violation of his probation. So they arrested him. He also didn't get good legal representation, and he was sent to prison for I don't remember how long, a very long time. It was a terrible case. It actually got quite a lot of media attention. People signed petitions, and Harris actually worked repeatedly to keep him in prison. Even when a judge released him and said, you know, this is obviously a manifestly unjust and you shouldn't be in prison anymore, she appealed the decision and went to keep him in, which I mean, that is appalling on a number of levels. But I think it also sort of really gives the lie to this recent pivot, you know, that she's done, you know, but that she's against mass incarceration.
Right.
And I mean, in fact, I mean, it was not that long ago. I think it was just before she was actually elected to Congress that someone asked her about legalizing marijuana. And she laughed. Her response was to laugh. Yeah, so that kind of.
Look, she comes from a long line. Bill Clinton was the same way. I mean, you were probably a young boy, if you were even born, at the time when Ricky Rector, when he actually left the campaign trail in 1992 to go back to Arkansas to preside over the execution of Ricky Rector, who was a man who was so mentally retarded that he actually asked the warden to save his piece of pie for him because he said he was going to come back and finish it after the execution. I mean, this was a horrible thing. This was a dog whistle to racists in the South, you know, because this was a black man he executed, to show that he was tough on crime. And that's what Kamala Harris was. And now she's completely pivoting, and it's disgusting, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's terrible. And I think we can sort of acknowledge that aspect of it, that there is a generational kind of gap in politics where Kamala Harris and a few others of her kind of political persuasion, they came of political age at a time when sort of pivoting to the center was what Democrats did and what they were supposed to do and how they were supposed to succeed. Now, you know, we can argue about how true that is, but even if we allow for that to sort of be a mitigating factor or like a sort of contextual kind of explanation for these things, I think the question we'd ask ourselves is also, even so, well, okay, well, why do we have to choose these people for president? You know, why do we have to go with the Kamala Harris's or the Hillary Clintons or the, you know, the Cory Bookers or other various like centrists who we know don't have a history of standing up for kind of progressive values.
Right. Well, I want to just mention, oops, I had your name on a little bit long. I just wanted to mention some of the other things before we go and talk about Beto. Let's see, she didn't attempt to take pot off of the DEA list of dangerous drugs. She incarcerated parents for truancy. That was part of that smart on crime thing. And there was actually, which is basically penalizing poverty. Because if you're poor and you have to go to work and you can't make sure that your kids go to school, you know, you shouldn't get incarcerated. And 2 women actually went to jail on that.
Yeah. I'm not sure what's smart on crime about putting parents in jail for their kids, you know, skipping school, but.
Yeah. I mean, the Color Lines wrote about that. That was a real egregious thing that she did. She opposed, while she had San Francisco, and she was the DA in San Francisco, she supported body cams there. She opposed the state law to have body cams. And she was against a bill requiring officers, her office, to investigate police shootings. And I remember when I was doing a piece on Occupy the LAPD, which was in the beginning of 2016. They actually set up tents outside of the LAPD. And I made a video about it. I interviewed a man who said, you can't expect these DAs to prosecute these killer cops because they need cops to make their other cases. So really, it should be somebody like the Attorney General who does the prosecuting. So you found out, apparently, I didn't realize this until I read your article, that she was against that bill.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think there's there's a lot of examples where Kamala Harris has fallen short of the kind of rhetoric that she claims. The other big one is that she has kind of pivoted also and rebranded herself as this kind of scourge of Wall Street and scourge of bank fraud and foreclosure fraud and that kind of thing. She took on the banks. It's somewhat true. That's kind of a complicated story, her dealings with getting kind of financial reparations. What is a less complicated story is that she set up this kind of mortgage fraud bureau, for lack of a better word. I can't remember what the exact name of it was, but it was meant to be a task force to actually go after mortgage fraud in California, which was the epicenter of all that stuff at the time. And that task force ended up prosecuting less fraud cases than a bunch of other states, and I think in some cases less than some district attorneys in certain states, which is pretty amazing, given that we're talking about the whole of California here. One of the second most populous state in the U.S. and also the sort of center point of bank fraud and foreclosure fraud, rather. So that sort of, I think, gives you another example of how politicians, and especially in this cycle, we're going to hear a lot of rhetoric. We're going to hear a lot of talk about people self-identify as progressive or what have you. A lot of times rhetoric is not actually backed up by tangible either records or actions or sometimes even words. Sometimes it's outright contradicted. But I mean, yeah, I think we're going to see that a lot.
You know what? You missed one thing in your extremely comprehensive article that I'll let you know about. I found this out from Carlos myself, is that there was $331 million that was supposed to go to the victims of fraudulent foreclosure. And she let Jerry Brown take that for the budget deficit in a year when there was the budget deficit. And when the budget went into surplus, she did not seek to get it back to then distribute it to the homeowners. And basically California had to be sued. And I think this lawsuit happened, now under Becerra, who's our new attorney general.
Right.
But, so she makes a big show of joining with the other attorneys general and getting the settlement. And then when it comes to actually seeing that it gets to the people who it's for, she doesn't follow through. And this just kind of reminds me of the grandstanding that she did when she was interviewing Brett Kavanaugh. I mean, she and Cory Booker made a big stink of how they were, going after him rhetorically. But, and probably I'm going to do another show on him if somebody writes the definitive article on Cory Booker. My hashtag for him is bought Booker, but maybe I'll wait for him to actually declare. I just, I wanted to do this with you because you also wrote the article on Beto. So, yeah, we know that Kamala Harris last year at this time was, fundraising in the Hamptons for all these multi-million-dollar donors. And really, unless you're going to be totally dependent on small dollar donations, I don't trust that you're going to represent the people.